The smell was the first thing Suyun noticed. Not the ship. Not the darkness of deep space pressing against the porthole like a bruise. The smell. Recycled air, machine oil, and something faintly sweet that she could never quite identify, no matter how many times she'd asked the filtration system's diagnostic log. She'd been aboard the GSV Harang 17 for 11 months. She still didn't know what that smell was. It bothered her more than she would ever admit out loud. She was eating cold rice from a pouch when the proximity alarm went off. Not the gentle three-tone chime that meant another freighter was passing through the Vethis corridor. This was the flat, ugly blare that lived at the back of every deep space engineer's nightmares. The one that meant something had gone wrong with the kind of wrongness that didn't negotiate. Suyun set the rice pouch down on her workbench, very carefully, next to the fuel cell regulator she'd been meaning to fix for 3 days. She pressed her thumb against the comm panel. "Suyun to bridge, what am I looking at?" Static. Then Captain Daejung's voice, clipped and careful in the way it got when he was trying not to sound scared. "We've got a Velkarath vessel, a big one, drifting. No drive signature." She picked up the rice pouch again, took another bite, thought about it. The Velkarath were not, in any formal treaty sense, enemies. They were also not friends. They were the kind of species that the Galactic Accord described in its diplomatic documents using phrases like culturally distinct conflict resolution methodologies and sovereignty-adjacent territorial expressions, which was bureaucratic language for they hit first and talked later, and they had the firepower to make that a reasonable policy. A drifting Velkarath vessel, this far from their home systems, with no drive signature, that was either a trap or a disaster. Suyun chewed slowly. "I'm going out to look," she said. There was a pause on the line. "Suyun, I'm not going aboard, just external scan. The long-range sensors on the ship are garbage, Daejung, you know that. I've been saying that for 8 months. She was already pulling on her EVA harness, tucking the rice pouch into her chest pocket. Cold rice kept. "I'll take a pod." She heard him exhale through his nose, that specific sound he made when he'd already decided she was right, but was still going to be annoyed about it. 30 minutes. You don't come back, I'm burning for the relay station. You won't have to. She mostly believed that. The Velkarath ship was called, according to the registration code she scraped with her scanner from 200 meters out, the Thren Vale Okus, which her translation module rendered as something approximating relentless in hunger. Cheerful name. The ship itself was a mid-class warlord's cruiser, not enormous by Velkarath standards, maybe 40 crew, built like a fist with engines attached. It had 4 of the big bone-white Karath spines running down its hull, which were decorative but also sent a message, the way a shark's teeth were technically just for eating. Right now, 2 of the spines were snapped off. The hull near the aft engine cluster had a rupture that she could have thrown a cargo loader through. Suyun drifted closer, using short bursts from her pod's maneuvering thrusters, and pointed her scanner at the drive manifold. It was catastrophically dead. The kind of dead where something had fed back through the primary conduit and burned out everything downstream. She'd seen that pattern before, once, in a maintenance simulation back at the Seoul Station training program. She remembered her instructor saying, "If you ever see this in the field, someone made a very stupid decision under very bad circumstances, and now you're the one dealing with it." She pulled up the life sign module, honestly not expecting much. The screen showed 43 faint readings, alive, just barely. Suyun sat with that information for a moment. She finished the last of the cold rice. The empty pouch crinkled in her pocket as she folded it. "Daejung," she said quietly into the comm. "Yeah?" "There are 43 of them in there. The ship's dying. Environmental systems are failing. I'm reading atmosphere at about 62% capacity and dropping." She did the math in her head, the way she always did, automatically, like breathing. "They've got maybe 9 hours. Long silence. She could almost hear him thinking. Almost hear him wanting to say not our problem, and knowing it was. "The Accord Emergency Protocol," he started, "applies to any sentient life in distress." "Yes, I know." She looked at the broken ship hanging in the dark. Something about it felt sad to her in a way she couldn't explain, like a very proud thing brought low. "I need volunteers and a portable atmospheric relay unit, and someone who knows Velkarath systems would be helpful, but I'm not going to be picky. Nobody on this ship knows Velkarath systems." "Then I'll figure it out as I go." Another exhale through the nose, longer this time. I'll get you your volunteers, Daejung said. She went in with 2 crew members, Hyunji from Cargo Ops, who was steady under pressure and didn't ask unnecessary questions, and a young navigation tech named Bum Suk, who had volunteered specifically because he'd said, with great confidence, that he was good at alien stuff. Soo-yeon had looked at him for a long moment and then decided that enthusiasm was a resource too. The airlock they used was on the ventral side of the Threnvale Ocus, partially jammed. Soo-yeon spent 19 minutes with her manual override kit convincing it to open. She talked to it while she worked, which was a habit she'd developed sometime around month 3 of her first deep space posting and had never managed to break. Come on. There, see? That wasn't so hard. A little more. Yes. Bumsuk watched this with visible fascination. Hyunji looked at the corridor beyond and said nothing. The inside of the Velkarath ship smelled like iron and something electric, and a third thing that hit the back of Soo-yeon's throat like a warning. The lighting was emergency red, which, on a human ship, would have been a specific wavelength of amber, and the corridors were narrower than they looked from outside, built for bodies that moved differently, she guessed. Everything was angled, the walls slanting inward toward the top, creating a permanent sense of enclosure. She kept wanting to duck even when she had clearance. They found the crew in the main gathering chamber, a wide, low-ceilinged room that the translation module tagged as something between common hall and place of binding. 43 Velkarath, unconscious or barely conscious, grouped in clusters. They were roughly humanoid in the broadest sense, 2 legs, 2 arms, bilateral symmetry, but the resemblance stopped there. Tall, skin the color of old ash, with raised vel lines running along their forearms and necks, which were bioluminescent markers that tracked their physiological state. Right now, every vel line in the room was a dim, struggling orange. Soo-yeon crouched next to the nearest one. A large individual, she guessed male based on the broader ridge crest above the eyes, though she wasn't certain. Velkarath gender presentation was not something she'd studied in depth. He was breathing in slow, shallow pulls. His vel lines flickered. Okay, she said quietly, mostly to herself. Atmospheric relay first, then power. What about, Bumsuk was looking around with wide eyes. What about the other ships? What other ships? He pointed at the navigation display on the far wall, which was still faintly active on backup power. She looked. 3 Velkarath military vessels, holding position approximately 40,000 kilometers out. Watching. Oh. Right. Soo-yeon stood up, looked at the display for a moment, then looked back at the unconscious crew around her. She could leave. That was the rational thing. This wasn't her emergency, wasn't her species, and those ships out there were going to arrive eventually, and they were absolutely going to have opinions about the presence of a human engineer aboard a disabled Velkarath warship. She picked up the atmospheric relay unit and started looking for the ship's environmental control hub. Help me find a junction panel, she told Hyunji. The Velkarath systems were not intuitive. That was a diplomatic way of saying they were designed in a way that seemed, at first inspection, to be deliberately trying to kill the person attempting to interface with them. Everything was haptic, pressure-sensitive, with no visible labels. You were expected to know where things were, which made sense if you'd grown up using this technology, and made no sense at all if you were a human engineer from Incheon, who had been doing deep space maintenance work for 6 years and had never once encountered a Velkarath conduit array. Soo-yeon sat in front of the environmental hub for 4 minutes without touching anything. She breathed. She looked. She traced the connections with her eyes, following the logic of the system the way you followed the logic of any system, because all systems had logic, even when they were trying not to show it. There. The pressure differential feeds ran horizontally. The atmospheric composition regulators ran at a 45-degree angle to them, which meant the integration point was... She pressed her palm flat against a section of the panel that looked like it might be decorative. It clicked open. She exhaled. Nice, Hyunji said behind her. Quiet, I'm concentrating. It took her 40 minutes to connect the relay unit properly. During those 40 minutes, Bumsuk kept nervously reporting on the position of the 3 watching ships, which were now 32,000 kilometers out, then 28, then 24. She told them to stop reporting unless they dropped below 10,000. He tried. He made it about 6 minutes before reporting 21. She didn't actually mind. It was useful data. She just needed him to think she was unruffled, because if he thought she was scared, he'd get scared, and then Hyunji would have to manage him, and Hyunji's energy was better spent holding the secondary conduit feeds that kept slipping. The atmospheric pressure in the room had started rising, slow but real, when the large Vel'Karath male groaned. Soo-yeon didn't look up from the panel. Bumsuk, keep an eye on him. What do I do if he? Don't make any sudden movements. Don't show your teeth if you can help it. That's a threat display. And if he reaches for a weapon, you call me immediately, but you don't run, because running triggers pursuit instinct. A pause. How do you know that? I read a lot, she said, which was true, and also was underselling the fact that she'd spent 3 weeks before this posting going through every xenobiological brief she could access on the top 12 species they might encounter in the Vethys corridor. She hadn't expected Vel'Karath specifically, but she'd read the file. The part about pursuit instinct had stuck with her. The sound behind her changed, movement, ragged breathing, then a low, grinding vocalization that her translation module took several seconds to process before rendering as, "What is this? What has entered here?" She finished tightening the last connection before she turned around. He was upright, barely. One hand on the wall, fell lines cycling through orange into an agitated, warning red. He was looking at her with eyes that had no whites, all deep amber, the pupil just a darker ring. He was, she noticed with the part of her brain that always noticed things at inconvenient times, approximately 2 meters tall, and he was furious in the specific way of someone who was also terrified and refusing to show it. Soo-yeon sat back on her heels. She held her hands open at her sides, the Vel'Karath gesture for, "I am not holding weapons." She'd looked that up. "Environmental systems are stabilized," she said, speaking slowly, letting the translation module do its work. "Your drive assembly failed. I've connected a relay to your atmospheric regulators. You were at 62% and dropping." She tilted her head toward the environmental hub. "It's stable now, about 78% and holding." He stared at her. The Vel lines were still red, but they'd stopped cycling. "You are human," he said. His translated voice came out flat and stripped of nuance, the way all machine translation sounded. But she could hear something working in the original vocalization, trying to recalibrate. "Yes. This is a Vel'Karath vessel." "I'm aware." "You have no authority here." She considered her response for a moment. Behind him, she could see other crew members beginning to stir. The ambient pressure rising had apparently been enough to pull them back toward consciousness. Bumsuk was pressed very carefully against the wall, doing an impressive job of not showing his teeth. "You're right," she said. "I don't have authority. I have an atmospheric relay unit and some tools and about 40 minutes of work." She paused. "You were dying, all of you. So..." She gestured at the room, at the slowly recovering crew. "Here we are." He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. His name, she would learn later, was Veth Karos Armeln, which translated roughly as Karos of the Meln line, 4th rank, which meant he was, as she had somewhat guessed from the ridge crest and the extra weight of authority in his voice, the ship's ranking military officer, the captain for human purposes. He'd been in a coma for 3 hours before she'd arrived. He had, as she would also learn later, woken up to find an unfamiliar human engineer sitting on the floor of his ship, covered in conduit grease, eating cold rice from a pouch she'd apparently had in her chest pocket the entire time she'd been working. She hadn't even realized she'd taken it out. She'd been hungry. The 3 watching ships turned out to be an escort patrol, Vel'Karath military units that had been waiting for the Threnvale Ocus to either recover on its own or be declared lost. They arrived 40 minutes after Veth Karos Armeln woke up, and the next several hours were a kind of controlled chaos that Soo-yeon mostly experienced from a corner of the gathering chamber, sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up, watching things happen. There were a lot of Vel'Karath in the room now. Some of them looked at her with hostility, some with confusion, several with what she was fairly certain was the Vel'Karath equivalent of intense curiosity, a kind of still-focused stare that would have been disconcerting if she hadn't learned to read it from the xenobiological files. 2 of the junior crew members kept drifting past her corner and then walking away quickly, which Bumsuk whispered was definitely on purpose, and which she chose to find funny rather than unsettling. Veth Karos Armeln handled the coordination with the escort ships. He was good at it, She watched him move through the room, assessing, directing, issuing instructions with the kind of clipped efficiency she associated with people who'd been making decisions under pressure for a long time. He had a slight drag in his left leg that she hadn't noticed when he'd first stood up, and she wondered if it was old or new. At some point, he came and stood near her corner, not at her, near her, looking at the room. She waited. "The relay unit," he said finally. "It is interfaced with the primary atmospheric regulators." "Yes?" "That configuration is—" A pause. The translation module hiccuped on the next word, rendering it first as irregular and then correcting to unexpected. "I had to improvise. Your integration points aren't labeled the same way ours are." She looked at her hands, still faintly greasy from the conduit work. She'd wiped them on her suit, but not quite completely. "If it causes problems later, you can reconfigure the junction on the left side. The pressure feed, not the composition regulator. They run at different angles. It should disconnect cleanly." He said nothing for a moment. "You know Velkarath systems," he said. "I figured out your Velkarath systems. There's a difference." She glanced up at him. The Vel lines on his forearms were a settled, muted blue now. She didn't know exactly what blue meant, but it felt calmer than the red. "I've never worked on a ship like this before, but most systems follow the same logic underneath. Energy needs to flow somewhere, environment needs to be maintained. You just have to find where the logic lives." He turned and looked at her directly. The amber eyes were strange to meet every time. Not because they were alien, exactly, but because there was so much going on in them, and she didn't have the context to read it all. She was used to that. She was used to being in situations where she was working with incomplete data. "You took a significant risk," he said, "entering this vessel, with those ships watching." "I know." "Why?" It wasn't really a question the way he said it. More like he was already working through possible answers and wanted to see which one she confirmed. She thought about how to answer honestly. She had a tendency, when she was uncertain about something, to give technical answers instead of real ones, because technical answers were cleaner. But he hadn't asked her a technical question. 43 people, she said. That was enough. The Vel lines on his neck shifted. She didn't know what that meant either. The Harang 17 and the Thren Vale Ocus ended up running in parallel formation for 4 days, while the Velkarath crew performed emergency repairs to their drive assembly. Repairs that went significantly faster, Suyan noticed, than they might have, because she had a good eye for structural damage, and Vethkaros Armeln had stopped letting pride get in the way of practicality. By the end of the first day, he had started asking her questions, technical ones, then others. She wasn't sure when it shifted. She thought it might have been the second day, in the engine compartment, when she'd made a mistake. She'd been explaining the drive-back failure pattern, showing him what she thought had caused the original rupture, and she'd made an error in her calculation, written it wrong on the working surface she'd been using. And he'd said nothing, but glanced at it with the kind of stillness that meant he'd noticed. And she'd caught it herself a second later and said, out loud, "Wait, that's wrong, I'm sorry," and crossed it out. She didn't know what she'd expected. Velkarath military culture, from everything she'd read, was not particularly forgiving of demonstrated error. But he'd just said, "Show me the corrected version," and that had been that. They ate together on the fourth day. Not intentionally, they both ended up in the working area they'd been using near the engine compartment at the same time, both apparently having decided to eat rather than continue arguing about the structural integrity of the secondary intake manifold. He had some kind of protein preparation that was dark and smelled sharply savory. She had the last of her cold rice pouches, plus a nutrition bar she broke in half without thinking, and handed part of to him. He took it, looked at it, ate it with the expression of someone who was neither impressed nor unimpressed, and was reserving judgment. "It's not very good," she admitted. "No," he agreed. She laughed. It surprised her, just came out. He looked at her with those amber eyes, and the Vel lines did a thing she hadn't seen before, a quick silver flicker, there and gone. "What does that mean?" she asked, pointing, briefly, at her own neck, to indicate what she'd seen. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There is not a clean translation." "Rough translation?" Another pause. The Vel lines were blue again, that settled, uncertain blue. Something like, a response to an unexpected thing that was not unwelcome. Suyan turned that over in her head. Felt warmth moving up from somewhere under her sternum, slow and unexpected as the silver flicker had been. She looked back down at her rice. "Okay," she said. The escort ships received orders on the fourth evening. She heard about it from Pumsuk, who had somehow made friends with a Velkarath junior crew member through an exchange involving a lot of pointing and a navigation display. The ships were being recalled to a sector conflict 3 systems over, and the Thren Vale Ocus would continue to its destination under its own power, which was now functional enough for slow travel. That meant the parallel formation was ending. She found out at the same time that she found out she'd apparently been awarded something. There was no ceremony. Veth Karos Armeln simply appeared in the doorway of the workspace while she was finishing packing her relay unit and held out his closed hand. She looked at it, uncertain, then held out her palm. He placed in it a small piece of bone-white material, smooth, slightly curved, about the length of her thumb. She recognized it, a Karath spine fragment, from the hull. The Velkarath give this to... He stopped. The translation module worked through something. Those who have acted with courage that did not require an audience. She looked at it sitting in her palm. It felt heavier than it should. "I was just doing my job," she said, which was true and also was not the whole truth, and she knew it. "Yes," he said, as if that were exactly the point. She curled her hand around the fragment and held it. Outside the porthole behind her, one of the escort ships was already beginning to turn, drive plume igniting in a long, bright line against the black. "There's a sector conflict," she said, not really a question. "Yes. Are you going?" A beat. "My orders are to deliver the crew and vessel to the Varath Meln station. After that..." He paused. "After that, I expect so." She didn't like that. She noted that she didn't like it. Noted it the way you noted an instrument reading that was trending in a direction you didn't want. Filed it, acknowledged it, kept going. "Be careful," she said. Which was a thing that people said and usually didn't mean much. She meant it. He looked at her steadily. The Vel lines shifted through something complicated, colors she hadn't seen before, layered. "When this conflict is resolved," he said, very carefully, as if he were translating his own meaning into words it didn't quite fit, "I will be passing through the Vethis corridor again." She met his eyes, all that amber and whatever lived behind it that she didn't have enough context to fully read but was beginning to, slowly, the way you began to understand a system you'd never worked on before, by following the logic until it started to make sense. "We're on the Vethis corridor route for another 18 months, she said. Not an invitation, exactly. More like a technical fact, offered with precision. He nodded once, and there was the silver flicker again, brief and bright. She was back on the Harang 17 for 3 hours before she noticed she was still holding the Karath spine fragment. She'd been carrying it in her closed hand through the airlock transfer, through the debrief with Dae-jung, through the walk back to her workstation where the fuel cell regulator was still sitting, still waiting, 3 days more broken than when she'd left it. She set the fragment on the corner of her workbench. It caught the fluorescent light and held it. Bumsock appeared in the doorway, still looking slightly dazed from the whole experience, which she felt was reasonable. "So," he said, "that was... yeah." "Go get some sleep," she told him, not unkindly. "Are you going to? Sleep?" She looked at the fuel cell regulator, then at the Karath spine fragment, then out the porthole at the stars, which were entirely indifferent to the last 4 days of her life. "In a while," she said. She picked up her tools, started on the regulator. The ship hummed around her with that familiar, recycled air machine oil smell, and that third thing she still couldn't identify, the faintly sweet undertone that had been bothering her for 11 months. She wasn't sure exactly what she was feeling. That was fine. She was good at working with incomplete data. You just followed the logic until it started to make sense. She worked until the ship's artificial night cycle shifted the corridor lighting to its dim amber, and when she finally did sleep, she slept well. The fragment sat on her workbench corner through the whole of the artificial night, bone-white and smooth, holding its small curve of light. The comm request came 14 weeks later. She was recalibrating a pressure sensor in the ventral maintenance corridor when Dae-jung's voice came over the ship-wide, sounding slightly strangled. "Suyun, there's a Velkarath vessel asking to establish a communication link. They're asking for you specifically, by name. They have the correct pronunciation, which is..." A pause. "Which is honestly remarkable." She set down her calibration tool. She thought about the cold rice she'd eaten on a disabled warship, the 4 days of parallel travel and difficult technical conversations that were also, underneath, something else entirely. The specific way that Amber Eyes had looked at her when she'd corrected her own error without being asked. The silver flicker, the bone-white fragment on her workbench. "Patch them through," she said. There was a brief crackle of translation calibration, and then a voice, low, direct, stripped of nuance by the machine, but not, she was finding, of meaning. Engineer Suyan. Veth Karos. She was aware of Daejong definitely listening on the bridge. She didn't particularly mind. The conflict? Resolved. A beat. "We are in the Vethis corridor." She looked at the pressure sensor in her hand, then at the corridor around her, familiar and slightly cramped and smelling of recycled air and machine oil and that sweet, unidentifiable thing. "I know a good place to run parallel formation for a while," she said, "if you don't have pressing orders." The pause before his response was short. She was getting better at reading what lived in his pauses. "We do not have pressing orders," he said. She smiled, alone in the ventral maintenance corridor, 37 million kilometers from the nearest inhabited system. She picked up her calibration tool. "Give me an hour," she said. "I'm finishing something,